friends, my name's Katie. Welcome back to my channel, Life Between Words. I have Wilder here with me today to help me do my wrap-up. He's just going to sit here and look cute, hopefully. We'll see how it goes. Like I said, we're going to do my March wrap-up. I did pretty well this month. I still didn't get through my two biggest books. If you'll recall, they were Middlemarch and Ship of Magic, which was the first book in Robin Hobb's Live Ship Traders trilogy. Anyway, didn't finish either of those huge books, so I'm just going to push those over into the month of April. But let's talk about the books I did read. Starting off the month was Tana French's Faithful Place. I was buddy reading this with Julie from A Girl in a Book and Stephanie from That's What She Read. I really liked this book. This is the third book in Tana French's Dublin Murder Squad series. Every one of the books in this series follows a detective that we meet in the previous book. So in this book, we meet the detective Frank Mackey, who goes back to his hometown when he receives a call from his family saying that they found the suitcase of his girlfriend from high school. He and this girl, Rosie, were supposed to run away together, and on the night of their departure, she didn't show up. He figured that she just went on without him, but when her suitcase shows up about 20 years later, he realizes that there might be something more nefarious going on. So he goes back and gets embroiled in this investigation that he's supposed to steer clear of, and it goes on from there. I will say, I pretty much had the mystery of this figured out the moment we met the person who ends up having committed the murder. And I don't know if I'm just becoming more used to mysteries and thrillers and if they're just becoming more predictable to me, or whether this is just a predictable plot. But to me, that almost doesn't matter, because really what I've learned about Tana French and her writing, the mystery takes a back seat to the psychology of the detective that we're following. So in this book, it has to do with what's going on inside of Frank Mackey's head. The mystery just serves as a vehicle in which to explore the depths of these characters that Tana French is following. And in that respect, I love it. And the mystery is still fun to follow, even though you have it figured out. So I still really, really love this. Tana French's writing is very literary. She sucks you in because the characters are so well developed. I mean, they are fantastic. All of Tana French's characters feel messy, and they feel very real because of their mess, but they're still really likable, and I love that. Next up, I read The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. I read this book with Meryl from A Blackbird's Books, and we both really enjoyed it, with some caveats. I thought the premise of this book was fantastic. It follows two slaves, although really it follows one of those slaves more closely, named Cora, who ends up running away on the Underground Railroad. But in Colson Whitehead's reimagining, the Underground Railroad is a real railroad underground, which sort of feeds into the fantasy, which that doesn't feel like the right word, but when you learn about the Underground Railroad when you're a kid, at least here in the United States, before you know anything about it, you kind of imagine it as if it were a real underground railroad. So the fact that that was how it was portrayed in this book, I thought was very clever, and it was very fast-moving. There were moments in this book where I just couldn't put it down. I was on the edge of my seat. I was in distress for Cora, our main character, and yet I never felt very connected to any of the characters. There was a lot of brutality in this book, and it was sort of like I was watching it happen and I was appalled at what I was seeing in my mind's eye. It was not fun. It was unpleasant, and it was hard to read. And on the other hand, I felt so detached from Cora because of the way she was written. I wasn't very moved by what was happening. What in some cases probably would have made me cry if I had felt more attached to a character, it didn't upset me in the same way. And I know I've said this so many times, but that really takes away from a story for me. While there were definitely moments and parts of this book and aspects of this book that I thought were fantastic, I really wanted to fall in love with Cora more than I did. I thought this book was worth it to read, and I really loved reading it with Meryl, but there were just some things about it that really didn't work for me entirely. Next up was Molokai. This was another buddy read, group buddy read with some of my friends. Let's see if I can name them all. Jess from Jess McGlynn, or Catch a Single Thought is her channel name. Julie from A Girl in a Book, Molly from Molly Reads, and Jordan from J Bookish. And I'm pretty sure that Jess and I are the only two from that group who have finished it, although I think Molly might be still working her way through. Jordan and Julie weren't feeling it, so they put it down. But Jess and I think really liked this book. This is about a young Hawaiian woman named Rachel, and we follow Rachel throughout her life in this book. As a child, she ends up contracting leprosy, which is called something else now, Hansen's disease, I think, but at the time of this book, it was called leprosy. And she was sent to a leper colony on Molokai. This is a historical fiction book because it started at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century. And one of the things I love about historical fiction is that you learn so much, and if it's done well, you don't feel like you're reading something from a history book. It's being told through a story. And so you're gaining knowledge in a really organic way, and that's my favorite. One of the things that I really loved about Molokai was that in this leper colony, life was still lived, and it was still fully lived despite the really, really hard circumstances, despite the fact that they were basically outcasts, despite the fact that they were living with this debilitating disease. People still fell in love, they still had deep friendships, they still laughed together. Everything that makes a life full still happened on this leper colony. There was this beautiful dichotomy of grief and pain and joy. To me, the most accurate depiction of life is when tragedy and triumph commingle, and I feel like this book did that beautifully. We were able to see that beautiful dichotomy played out in one woman's life. Once again, though, kind of like in the Underground Railroad, I didn't feel super connected, at least with Rachel. There were other characters in the book, side characters, that I felt very attached to, but with Rachel, I didn't so much, but there were parts in this book that moved me to tears. Particularly the ending I felt was very strong. It really tugged at my heartstrings. That to me tells me that this book really affected me and touched my heart in some kind of profound ways. So I really enjoyed this book, and I'm so glad that I read it. Next on my ebook this month, I read a book called Mariana by Susanna Kearsley, and I really enjoyed myself while reading this book. The premise is a little bit silly, so there's some suspension of disbelief, but it's just so much fun. This book reminded me a lot of Kate Morton, but with a little bit more romance, and also the mystery takes kind of second fiddle. It's not really a mystery, but it was very atmospheric in tone. It follows our main character, Julia, who lives in present day and finds herself drawn to this particular house called Grey Weathers. And then while she's living in this house, she keeps getting pulled back to like this 1600s. So Julia ends up living this double life as both herself, Julia, in present day, and then as Mariana back in the 17th century. In order for me to enjoy romance, I kind of have to feel like my heart needs to pound a little bit. I need to feel some butterflies in my stomach, and I definitely did with this book. But I also, once again, loved the historical elements, and I loved the characters so much. These are the kind of characters that you just fall in love with. Oh, Rosamund Pilcher, that's the other author that this book kind of reminded me of. She draws her characters similarly to Rosamund Pilcher, but the atmosphere, sort of the gothic, dark atmosphere, felt more like a gothic romance, like a Kate Morton. So anyway, I really enjoyed this book. It was so much fun, and the ending was not what I expected. So I was really pleasantly surprised with that little twist at the end. And the last book that I read this month was called In the Land of White Death by Valerian Albanov. This follows Valerian Albanov himself. These are his journals. He was a Russian sailor back at the turn of the 20th century. And he and his crewmates on the St. Anna were on an expedition. It wasn't necessarily an exploratory expedition, it was more a hunting expedition. But anyway, they were on the St. Anna. It got stuck in the ice in the Northeast Passage, and he and the captain are butting heads, and he decides to leave, and a bunch of the crew ends up leaving with him. These are his journal entries as he and these other men try to make it back over the Arctic to civilization. It's extremely harrowing. It's very riveting. It reads like a thriller. I really love a good survival story, and one of the things that I love about survival stories is the fact that my life is pretty easy, and reading about an event that someone had to go through and they survived it, but they might not have, is both inspiring and humbling for me, because I always put myself in that situation and think, I probably wouldn't make it. If, the zombie apocalypse happened tomorrow, I'd be a goner. Thankfully, I'm married to someone who would totally rule during a zombie apocalypse. If you like survival stories, this is a great one, partly because this is a survival story told in his own words, and he's actually a really insightful, beautiful writer. So those were all the books that I read in the month of March. I did a pretty good job. I got about almost halfway through Ship of Magic and maybe a third of the way through Middlemarch. I'm really enjoying both of those books, so I'm excited to keep going. Please, if you liked this, like, comment, subscribe. I'd love to know if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts are. And also, I still haven't put up answers to the Q&A that I talked about last week, so if you have any more questions, feel free to ask them down below. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go check out my previous video. I will link it in the description box. And I hope you guys are having a great beginning to April. And I think that's it. Bye! My dad said to me today that Wilder, when he sits like this, reminds him of Winston Churchill, which just kind of cracked me up.